Hey everyone, this is Scott from certmedia.com. In this video we'll be covering UpdraftPlus. This is going to be the free version we are covering. We're going to talk about the use case. I'm going to go over some of the best practices from my experience, and we're just going to talk about the general usage of UpdraftPlus. So UpdraftPlus is quite simply a backup plugin. You set it up because you either need to take a one-time backup before making a large variety of changes, or you want to set up a scheduled backup for your website that is automated. There really is there's not really a bad time to ever back up your website. Just make sure that you're not backing up during peak traffic hours. The user interface is quite simple. You install it and you can click Backup Now. This quite simply allows you to take a backup of your database and files. You could choose to exclude in Updraft Premium certain database tables or to only back up certain database tables. You can also choose to exclude files. This is included in the free version, but it's quite limited in the default settings. You can just exclude plugins, themes, uploads, or any other directories found in WP content. Keep in mind that other plugins do write to WP content for image uploads. WooCommerce and BuddyPress both do, so you need to keep that in mind if you choose to not back up those files. One great thing is if you have a developer working on the website, you can set it to be that the backup is only able to be manually deleted, and even if a retention limit is hit, which we'll get to here in a minute. But essentially, it's useful if you want to have a restore point before you made drastic changes to the website and you don't want to make sure that it gets lost. This is particularly useful if you're backing up on server instead of offsite, which you should be backing up offsite regularly. But if you are backing up on the server, you have to make sure that you have a retention limit in place, or else you'll find yourself constantly running out of disk space, and I do run into this quite a bit. On the secondary tab, you have the Migrate and Clone, which is basically just a promotional tab to create a temporary clone of your website on their server. And the Migrator add-on is a paid add-on for UpdraftPlus that just makes it easy to migrate a site from one site to another site or to one server to another server. Very useful bits of functionality. Under the Settings tab, this is where you could start making some interesting changes. As you can see, it shows that it supports a lot of remote storage systems, and we're going to get to those here in a minute. Primarily, you could choose a file backup schedule. You could choose to do it on an interval or do it manually. Personally, if you're hosting them on site, you need to make sure, number one, that you're not going to run out of any disk space and that you don't have too many backups in retention. So if you're going to back up your files, let's say weekly, but your database daily, you should have enough of the database backups in this case to match the number of files. So let's just say we want it to be backed up weekly, and we only want to retain one backup of the files. We'll want to retain 7 database backups. Your database is typically pretty lean unless you're on a WooCommerce or BuddyPress website, where the database will grow as users grow and as you get more sales. Really, your only issue with backing up in UpdraftPlus is going to be the limitation of your disk space and the event of you being hacked, because it is quite common if you're backing up locally for malware on the site to just delete common backup folders. Typically, they check for UpdraftPlus because it's the same folder structure for almost every website. And the other one they check for is all-in-one WordPress migration, which we haven't covered yet, but it does have a backup functionality that is quite popular and very effective. So that's something you need to keep in mind. But this is fine. Your uploads don't really change all that much. If you're integrating a new plugin like WebP Express, which we did do a video on, or you're doing image compression, you will want to have a backup of your uploads. That way, in case the images get grainy, which will happen if you're compressing them, or images get lost, such as doing a regenerate thumbnails, you're going to want to make sure that you at least take a backup of your uploads on a weekly basis, and that you have it stored somewhere. Personally, for clients that I maintain their websites on, I take a backup of both the database and the uploads, so everything in the WordPress uploads directory, once daily, and I retain 90 days worth of backups. So I can restore basically anytime in a 30-month period, restore all their files and any variation of their database, in the event of something catastrophically going wrong. And it's all hosted off-site, so even if their site is hacked, I still have the files and have a means of restoring in the event of them being hacked. Then you can go into the remote storage option. So you have the UpdraftPlus Vault, which is their integrated service. It's basically a paid offsite backup service. It's built on AWS, and if you want to pay for options, it works very easily. You pay if you need 5 gigs of storage, you will pay $35 a year. If you need 250 gigs of storage, you'll pay $450 a year. The sites can get quite large depending on how many backups you have. So let's just say, for instance, you have a 5 gig website. So that's not a very large website. TheDailyExposition.com, before I kind of redesigned it and I threw away all my old content, I did it fairly recently even, it was about 5 gigs or so on its own just from images. And I restore up to 90, and I keep 90 days of backups. So you take 90 days worth of backups, you multiply it by 5 gigs, you need 450 gigs of storage. That's very expensive on their plan. So that is something you need to keep in mind when you're choosing their service. Is if you have a very large website, it can get quite expensive. And having the flexibility of having more restore points is something to keep in mind. And the Updraft Vault is kind of a mixed experience. One thing that you can do for free, though, is FTP. You do have FTP integration. If you have another server that you're basically just using as a means of storage, I've seen some users set this up with an actual physical box in their house, where they send their backups to and they connect to via FTP. This is a great option. If you have another host that you're able to back up files to, let's say you're paying for a S3 instance, which you can do over here, you could just send the files over there. Just keep in mind, with the FTP integration, don't just grab a host like HostGator who gives you unlimited storage, because that's something they will ban you for, and they're not very apologetic about it. You have to use a service that has FTP, which you're not going to find in most of the common providers like Google Drive, OneDrive, etc. And the ones that do, they typically have caps, even if they do promise unlimited. So keep that in mind. You could just back it up to your Dropbox account if you do have Dropbox. I have a Dropbox account, but I couldn't tell you what its login was or when the last time it is I used. But there is a relatively easy way to set it up. You'll just click here to authenticate. You need to be logged into your Dropbox account, and then you authenticate it after you saved your settings, and then click this link and it will authenticate Dropbox with your WordPress website, and the connection will be there for it to back up your site. Really, the default settings work out of the box for this. The exclusions are actually quite good as well. It ignores backups, it ignores the cache folder entirely, and it's an ideal configuration. The Microsoft Azure is another decent option if you have an Azure account, but it is only able to be used through a paid add-on. OpenStack is also a add-on, if I recall. You can quite literally go to their store though and view a complete list of all the add-ons. Just make sure that whatever provider you're going to use, you grab the add-on for it and only it, and you'll really be fine. There's so many different sub options though that I'm not going to read through all the services, but you have a healthy amount of options. You can link it to Google Drive. That is one important detail. For G Suite users, you can link this to your G Suite account to use Google Drive. Just keep in mind that Google Drive, they do give you unlimited on G Suite, but again, at a certain point, they may flag you. But that's probably your best option if you're trying to get the most bang for buck. Even if you're a single user on G Suite with one user account, I believe they give you 1 terabyte of storage, which even if you had a 5 gig website with 90 days of retention, that would be 450 gigs. That's not all that much. You have the option to add a database encryption phrase. This is kind of useless. For most websites, you don't need to do this, but you can add an encryption phase through a premium add-on. You have to get the UpdraftPlus premium mode, which is another paid add-on. Starts at $42 a year. Personally, it's okay. That's all I have to really say on it. It's okay. I personally don't use it though. Email, if you want to have an email report sent to you, you're able to do so via this box, and it automatically extracts it from the site admin address. If you're unsure of what this email address is, you go to settings, you go to general, and it's whatever your administrative email is. A lot of people just don't actually have the correct email in there, and they get surprised when they find out that they've had the wrong email, especially with the new WordPress feature that reminds you every 6 months, hey, is this still correct? And it's quite useful. The expert settings is really meant to help debug. There are times with UpdraftPlus that you are going to have issues, particularly in slower hosts. The host that I've had the most issues with trying to use UpdraftPlus in has been GoDaddy. Even on a fairly small website of around 450 megs or so, it takes forever to run UpdraftPlus on their hosting. There are times that I will be backing up a client site on GoDaddy, particularly. I'll back it up. It takes so long. I'll get up and do anything else, come back, it's still not done. And then I just kind of forget about it because I'm having to deal with GoDaddy being slow. So you can do a couple of options in here that may help you with this. Number one, Updraft automatically splits the backup archives under a certain size. If your website has so if you choose a higher file size, it's going to take more resources to create that archive because it has to load the file. It needs to open up the file and add new files into it. It needs to extract it on restore. But the advantage is you have less physical files on disk. Also, in some really weird host and server configs, if you have a 32-bit limit, you may have a hard limit of how large a single file can be, as it mentions right here, of 2 gigs. So keep that in mind. If you're on a slower host, try lowering the split archive to a smaller interval. Even if you have a fairly small website, let's say you have a 500 meg website, if it's 200 megs as your archive split, you're not going to have that many extra files for it to be of major concern. So that's something worth trying if you're noticing that your backups take forever to finish on your host. And then, as I mentioned here, delete the local backup. This will check to delete any superfluous backup files from your server after the backup run finishes. Sometimes if a backup is finished, there will be remnants or temporary files. Let's just make sure that they are removed. You could change your backup directory, but the only caveat is naturally it has to be writable. The Updraft directory is totally fine. Never place this, though, in your uploads directory. This will cause you major issues when you're trying to do a backup, and it can cause it to where you're backing up copies of your backups. There are quite a few backup plugins that do this all the time. Basically, you back up UpdraftPlus and it goes to your plugins folder or your uploads folder. It runs through and it does another backup, and now it's backing up the previous backup. And so it just gets exponentially larger even when your website doesn't. So keep that in mind. Use the server SSL certificates. Updraft will use its own SSL certificates to verify for remote sites. This is fine, shouldn't really matter. You could choose to not verify an SSL certificate if your server is weird, but in 2020, almost every website now should have an SSL. Shouldn't have to worry about that. You could choose to disable the SSL entirely where possible. I don't recommend doing that. When you're transmitting data to somebody like Dropbox, you have to use an SSL certificate. But even if you don't, it would allow somebody, in theory, the odds of it happening are very minimal, to sit there in between the upload process and through a man-in-the-middle attack, they could download the files if they really wanted. Or they could inject files in that stream. But the odds of that happening on your own website are completely silly. It would be astronomical for the odds of that to actually happen to you in the real world, but it's something to be wary of. Just keep using the SSL. It does not matter. If your host has issues with it, you need a better host. That's the honest truth. You can enable automatic updates, so ask WordPress to automatically update UpdraftPlus when it's available. I actually did a video on how to turn off all automatic updates, and I do recommend doing that. Even in reliable plugins like UpdraftPlus, W3 Total Cache, Yoast, Rank Math, etc., there are bad updates, and they do break things. So I don't ever trust automatic updates unless you have a really good backup system with recent backups taken on a regularly scheduled basis. The other important detail is you want your backup to be taken relatively soon before you automatically update the website. That way, you're not running into an issue where your backup was taken either before or after, and then your previous backup was from 24 hours ago. So something to keep in mind. Under your advanced tools, this is mostly just, as all of these sites are, debugging tools. It gives you information for the developers to debug issues. Your lock settings, you can lock access to the UpdraftPlus settings here. This will basically just require a password. It does require, though, to have UpdraftPlus Premium. This is kind of a cool feature if you don't want anybody meddling with your backups. So somebody logs into your WordPress website as an admin. They try to get into the settings to delete it. You can put a password. But if somebody already has access to WordPress Administrator, they can do whatever they want. Updraft Central is like a remote dashboard that allows you to update your website and take backups through UpdraftPlus. It's an okay service. It's not something I'd really recommend if you had an alternative. It's just kind of limited. And the UpdraftPlus service as a whole is kind of expensive for what they offer, as we saw with the Vault. But it's an interesting option. You can also choose to use a self-hosted dashboard where you host it locally on your own website, but I just wouldn't use their service, honestly. You can do a search and replace against the database. This is really great if you're migrating from a host or from one website to another. So let's say you had an HTTP as your domain. You could replace HTTP with HTTPS via this tool, so that we have no mixed content errors. Or if you change your domain from certmedia.com to certmedias.com, you could do a search and replace to fix all the 404 errors. But I wouldn't buy the premium version for that functionality. The site size is a useful bit of functionality to count the total size of every one of your directories, since this site is fairly small. It's only got like 4 installed plugins and a couple of random images. It's fairly lightweight. This is useful if you're trying to figure out, number 1, how much disk space you're going to need for your backups, and number 2, trying to figure out your retention policy. If you're going to hold on to backups for 90 days, you can at least do the basic math of assuming you have 500 megs and you need it for 90 days. You're going to need 4.45 gigs. You could kind of do that math. But you have to keep in mind that as your site grows, you will be getting slightly larger, and the more images you upload will increase the size. But this is a good tool to have when trying to at least figure out your initial settings. Export and import settings, for most websites, this doesn't matter because the free version has no real settings to export. But if you do have multiple sites, so let's say you own a couple of websites and you want to have them all backed up by FTP, you set that up on the website. You can export the settings here and import them on another website. Great bit of functionality. The wipe settings will, as it mentions, it will reset the entire plugin. It will delete all the plugin settings, the progress information for any in-progress updates, but keep in mind that none of your existing backups from your cloud storage will be deleted. It should delete on-site backups, and then you'll have to basically restart everything from the beginning. And then you can reset the UpdraftPlus tour, but I've never found a good reason to do that. And then Updraft Premium is just their why you should upgrade screen. As it mentions, you get cloning and migration, incremental backups, and a bunch of other good stuff. This is everything there is in the free version. It is very powerful, at least for the basic bits of functionality. You can back up your website on here. You can do it relatively easily. If I want to back it up, and I just wanted to back up everything, I can let it run, and it's pretty speedy. And it does give you good feedback. Just keep in mind about the archive split limit that we touched on in the settings window. especially when you're on a slower host. This is a VPS and it's already done. Really quick, small site, already backed up, and it won't be deleted unless you manually delete it because we checked it. If you do have any questions about the free version, please feel free to ask in the comments below. I will gladly try to help you out. But otherwise, make sure to like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.